Hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Nakala Maddock and I'm the CEO of NutriSoil. NutriSoil is a big worm farm that produces a biostimulant, a seed inoculant and a foliar fertiliser through a unique permaculture recycling system. We are third generation worm farmers and have been in business for nearly 30 years. The family business, originally founded by Graham and Lynn Maddock in 1995, has grown to be a trusted name in the biological industry. The NutriSoil team is passionate about the next generation of agriculture and how farming to rebuild soils can be a huge solution to keeping family farmers on farms and helping to stabilise our planet's climate for future generations. Currently, many farmers are faced with waterlogging, with flooded crops and pastures, for some a devastating season. And we wanted to help where we can, to give everyone an opportunity to support from an international expert to address the challenges and prepare for the future. I'm here in Canberra with internationally renowned soil microbiologist Walter Jehne. Walter is a specialist in hydrological cycles, which is pertinent to our current forecast of extreme weather events, such as droughts, fires and now floods. Thank you for speaking with us today, Walter.
Yes, good morning Nakala, and good morning everybody. It's nice to be here and it's actually very pertinent to sort of talk about that. By way of introduction, I don't know about the international recognised, but I'm a soil microbiologist. Had a lot of research experience in CSRO, forestry, tropical crops and pastures, soils. Worked a long time then in strategic policy, how do we change agriculture or make agriculture future competent. But for the last 15 years been retired and working very much with farmers, really leading innovative farmers again through NGOs, Healthy Soils Australia, Soils for Life with our ex-Governor General Michael Jeffrey, and now through another NGO called Regenerate Earth, looking at these bigger global consequences and threats that we're facing. And it's very, very pertinent, this discussion about hydrology, floods and soils, because we've been in this game now for 50 years with warnings about climate change, soil degradation. More or less now there's going to be 8 billion people on the planet, up to 10 billion people by 2050, so the need to grow more food sustainably, reliably, in a more extreme environment is very important. What we've also known scientifically is really it's not just CO2, it's not just temperature rises, but in fact it's a dangerous hydrological climate extremes that are compounding the whole problems. And it's these dangerous hydrological climate extremes that are impacting. They're impacting now, and they're actually impacting severely, particularly on agriculture. So it's our capacity to come to terms with these extremes, be they hurricanes, floods, storms, but then the corollary of them, droughts, aridification, wildfires. They're all in the same game. These are no more reliable rainfalls that we were grown up with, that whole agriculture evolved on, and we've got to redesign resilient, buffered agricultural systems that can actually accommodate these hydrological extremes. We've got to do that, in a sense, in this next decade, because these extremes are actually collapsing and crippling biosystems, whether it's drought, profitability, wildfires. It's happening now. And so we really have to say, well, how can we do it? And of course we go back to how did nature do it? How did nature create this buffered ecological system that we evolved in and totally depend on? And so really what we're focused on is understanding the natural processes of pedogenesis, of soil formation, of nutrient availability, of plant growth, the whole dynamics, and can we actually regenerate those natural processes to build resilient buffered biosystems. So this discussion that we're having today, sure, we're responding to an exceptionally wet period that we've been having in Australia, and of course the flooding and the waterlogging that's a consequence of it. But basically it's just a symptom of these extremes, and how do we build more resilient buffered systems through soil regeneration right across into the future. And so it's very important and very timely that we have this discussion.
Wonderful. So how today is going to work, Walter, is it's a question and answer event. So I've had farmers send in questions that I can ask. And I also have people online here who might be live and can actually ask questions as well. So I'll start with the opening question. My opening question today, Walter, is how, as farmers, can we protect our farms from the impact of floods?
Right, and absolutely, and it's not necessarily protect, but how do we actually accept this reality that we are in, climate extremes, and how do we redesign, as we talked about, buffering and resilience. We're always going to have the extremes, but whether they impact us adversely depends very much how well buffered the systems are. And as I said before, that's where we have to come back to first principles to say, look, how did nature actually create that ecosystem we evolved in? Where are the bases of buffering resilience in nature? And in a sense, going back to first principles, and let's pull that up on the whiteboard, basically let's go back to those first principles to see how did the actual earth or nature create the earth's soil carbon sponge, the whole development of soils, and then the hydrological functions that arose from those soil development process. So let me come here on this whiteboard. It's all very sophisticated. So I hit that button and I can put a colour, and I now actually hit that, I think. Okay, here we are. Right, see, it's working, isn't it?
It is. Well done.
Well done. And this is just a little diagram, and it's very simple, but nature, it doesn't have to be complicated. And what we've done here, we've drawn sort of 5 pieces of mineral particles, but they're all clustered together in a sense in a little rock. Actually, let's make sure I've got black. Yep. So there's 6 now, there's 7. But they're all tightly together as a rock, and basically when you look at their bulk density, their weight to volume, they've got a bulk density from 2.6 to 3.5 grams per cc. That's just the weight to volume, which means they're dense, effectively, rock. And that's in a sense what nature started with, and just a compacted rock. And of course, if we have a water drop that then falls onto this rock, we know that basically it just will shed water, run off, and be lost. And of course, that's where we were 420 million years ago, before there was, in a sense, vegetation on the land surface. The land was just bare, dry rock. The oceans, of course, existed. But then nature said, if I'm going to colonize and grow on land, I have to sort of change this matrix and make it receptive for hydrology. And what nature did, it basically, we can actually change this, let's put it green, and basically it said, look, we can grow some fungi, and we grow fungi from the estuarine edges of the oceans, and we can grow those fungi over this rock, and they can solubilize some of this rock minerals, and in growing over these rocks, they're leaving behind organic detritus. This is really just the old cell walls of these fungi. And that then moved the whole system to create the Earth's soil carbon sponge. So that's exactly the same matrix that I've got here. Remember, I drew 2 more circles, so we have to have 7 circles. But what basically is now characteristic of this sponge, it's got this organic detritus that has basically separated the particles. They've been broken up, they've been solubilized, and now we have an open, more looser matrix. We can say that because basically this has got a bulk density, a healthy soil of 1.2 grams per cc. So it's already telling us that basically up to half or over half of the volume of this matrix is made up of, in a sense, air, nothing, voids. So all nature has done is added nothing to this rock to create the sponge. Okay, and it's done that by just simply putting organic detritus. Here I've drawn them as little red bed springs to try and get you the notion of a sponge, but they're just the detritus from these fungi and these organisms. So we're getting the message that soil microbial ecology, solubilizing, breaking up rock, leaving behind organic detritus, creates a sponge. But this is now profound, because once we have a sponge, what we have, of course, is we've got a lot of air, right? So we've got a lot of air in here. And when we have a lot of air, we can actually infiltrate a lot of water. Okay, so clearly if there's a raindrop, you should draw it in blue perhaps, but if there's a raindrop now falls on this, it can infiltrate and it can actually sort of then be retained. Okay, and this is so important because now we can hold water in these soils. And if it's retained, we can also, of course, actually I have to kill that. If it's retained, we also can have it available. Okay, so now we have water availability, and of course that's critically important for growth. But the last thing that's perhaps very critical and pertinent to our discussion this morning, we also now have buffers. Okay, because now if we have a rainfall event or extreme rainfall event, then we have a capacity of this soil to infiltrate, retain and buffer that water. And so we don't have the runoff, the flood peaks. And so this simple illustration tells us that it's a simple matter of creating healthy soil carbon sponges that gives us the capacity to infiltrate, retain and buffer extreme flood events. Okay, and up to 50% of the volume of that soil is able to be, in a sense, retained water. So let's go blue. So hang on, blue. Okay, so basically we can have 50% of the volume of this matrix, in a sense, stored water. And that stored water is all now positive water. That's positive water because it's available for plant growth, and it's positive because it's not flooding off, and it's not causing erosion, it's not inundating, it's not destroying. Okay, and so it's that simple question of growing this sponge, and it tells us very easily, as farmers, the imperative as we get hydrological extremes is to build these buffered sponges, because they will be able to buffer the floods, but also, of course, they're making water available, which is, of course, enabling us to drought-proof and, have water when, in fact, the corollary of the flood happens when we have the droughts. If we have a fixed amount of water, it's a question of, do we lose it or do we use it? And this way we can actually conserve it and use it. So look, that's the simple well, I don't know if that's the right word, but this is a simple thing. We just keep water in our soils. We make the point 50% of a soil can be water. So if you're thinking of your soil, you've got a square metre of soil. If it's healthy, down to the depth of 2 metres with root zones and stuff like that, every square metre of land surface can hold 1 cubic metre of stored water. Okay, so think how good that is, how that water stored in our in-soil reservoirs. Okay, this is now important, in-soil reservoirs. Because these things become our really critical strategic infrastructure. We don't need concrete dams, we don't need culverts, it's impossible to do that. But we can create our in-soil reservoirs. We can put 1 metre of stored water on every square metre of regenerated land surface. And that's really the power, because that gives us infiltration, water retention, drought proofing, productivity and storm buffering. So critically important. Now I hit there and I can take this across, and actually we bring it to the next level. We bring it now from that microscopic level to the farm level. Okay, and so if you're a farmer, you're basically interested in what we've got here, which we call a hydrograph. And it's a simple relationship of actually flow, how much water is flowing over time. But it's a very, very profound picture, you see, because basically if you've got a compacted, degraded soil, a bit like the rock that we saw in the beginning, then if we have to say a 50 millimeter rainfall event, only 2 inches, what happens, that rain will flood off in a massive flood peak. So we end up with a flood, we end up with erosion, we end up with massive cost, risk, crops washed out, infrastructure washed out, and we end up actually with extra cost where we have to now start building infrastructure, both repairing and avoidance. So this is very, very deleterious, very expensive flood peak situations. And that happens because we've basically compacted the land, and basically if we've got degraded soils, compacted land, say with 0.3% carbon, not enough bed springs, then we've got this hydrograph. Again, it's more serious than we've shown because it's not just the flood, erosion, cost, risk issues, but automatically we've designed in, and you can see that, isn't it? We've designed in drought, because the water that, in a sense, isn't being stored in our soil, the water that's run off isn't available, so we've got a drought, and we're back to more erosion, more costs, more risk, and more infrastructure, supplying water from concrete dams or something. So it's a double whammy, and in a world where we're getting hydrological extremes, this becomes cactus, it becomes basically bankruptcy. So farmers, as they become more and more stressed, under more pressure, their soils are degrading, and we've got hydrological extremes, you're more or less guaranteed to fail. And the only way out of this, as nature did, is actually what we saw before in our little diagram. Because if we can improve the bed springs, if we can improve the soil carbon, and if we can bring that soil carbon up to 3% soil carbon, just say, and that's not high, 3% soil carbon, then we get a fundamentally different hydrograph, a fundamentally different flow curve. And of course, instead of going up as a flood peak, the same volume under the curve, I don't know if I've drawn it exactly the same volume, but that you'll get this long, flat hydrograph. So the water is in a sense retained in that soil sponge and in those in-soil reservoirs. And while there will still be some runoff, to say, okay, if this is the holding capacity, while there still will be some runoff, it's nothing like the runoff in the flood peak, because most of it is stored in these in-soil reservoirs. And what this gives us, agriculture is extremely important, because this will give us what we've written here, the longevity of green growth. Okay, so by having that water retained, we can have longevity of green growth. And that's, in a sense, productivity, that's high value cropping capacity. And you can think of it this way, like if we've got a flood event, most of the water runs off, so we've got a growing period, this is time, we might have a growing period up to 50 millimetre event of, 10 days. Okay? But if we have that water retained in our in-soil reservoirs, then we've got a growing period under this other hydrograph of basically 100 days plus. Okay? Because that water is available. And this is profound because it's the actual productivity depends not just on how fast things grow, but for how long they can grow. And under this scenario, we've got 10 times the growth. We've got 1,000% productivity dividend from simply building the sponge, from simply having that water available. Now, for a farmer to have 1,000% productivity, a tenfold productivity potential, is enormous. And again, so this is what the sponge, in a sense, gives us, right? And so, at a farm level, yes, it's your capacity to manage these hydrographs, to go from this flood risk event where you're basically losing, to get to a situation where you're infiltrating that water, and because of that you've got longevity of green growth. Whereas before, that water, that land would be either bare, dry again, or otherwise it'd be inundated. Now you've got basically crops growing through all that period. So critically important. That same situation can be taken at a bigger landscape level, and basically, whereas we've gone from the microscopic to the farm level, and now we're going to actually a landscape level, and we can represent this as, in a sense, Australia. You see, what we have a situation now where we have humid air that's flowing across the continents, whether it's La Nina, El Nino, different quantities, but humid air. But for that humid air to sort of rain, it has to precipitate. And obviously it often precipitates on mountains because the humid air flows up, is under high pressure. When it goes over the top of the mountain, it goes into low pressure, and of course low pressure can't hold that water, precipitates. But it's what happens to every one of those 100 raindrops that's important. See, can they basically infiltrate into the soil? We used to have in nature upland wetlands, that, like alpine areas that stored a lot of that water and really captured a lot of that rainfall. The vegetation assisted in that rainfall as well. And with that, we had this phenomena here of hydrostatic recharge, subsoil water flows flowing down throughout the soil. I've exaggerated the profile a little bit, but basically this water would, am I in red? This water would then sort of come out as springs, right? And really we had basically a whole landscape that was hydrated with hydrostatic water flows, subsoil, and then coming out as springs, and then the rest of the water flowing into wetlands and our inland deltas. In fact, Australia was exquisitely adapted with very effective upland wetlands that basically retained or captured a lot of that rain initially, recharged these hydrostatic flows, retained it in these inland deltas and wetlands, the Macquarie marshes, etc., to the extent that if we look at the Murray-Darling Basin, which is where we grow 40% of Australia's food, 6% of that Murray water actually flowed out to the oceans. 94% was retained naturally in the landscape to give you longevity of green growth, resilient, flood mitigation, because that water was in the soils. But what we've done really, we've wiped out many of those wetlands because we've been up there grazing and cultivating and burning and forest clearing. We've basically degraded the soil infiltration and therefore the springs and the water flow. And basically we still get flooding now on these inland deltas, but they're no longer in the deltas, they're all over our agricultural land. And so we basically compromised this whole hydrology across the basin and across these wider landscapes. And this is of course Australia, but it's happening everywhere. We've done this everywhere. And so this is again where we've said, look, here's the sponge, the microbial, micro hydrology of those soils. Here it is at farm level, our hydrographs, and here it is at landscape level where we have compromised this hydrology. And really the issue, Nakala, and sorry this has been a bit long, but the issue is really how do we rebuild that sponge to basically fix the farm and then to fix these landscape, because buffering these hydrological extremes is the critical situation. And as that first slide showed us, we can go back. How do we go back? No? Okay, I don't know. Hey, here we go.
Yeah.
Again, here we go. And okay, and how do we go back? We go back here with the fungi, the microbes that create soil sponges, because this is where our whole biostimulation of the microbial ecology is so important. Okay, because ecology, because that's really where the whole engine of soil pedogenesis and hydrology is starting from. And this is really the building block, the tool that we need to rebuild the system. The good news is we can do this. We can do this through natural regenerative farming practices, but we've only got a very short time to do this so that we buffer the hydrology in these landscapes. So look, I hope that's an overview, because all the questions that we're going to be looking at, I think this is a context to understanding what and how might be applicable. Right, now I'm not sure how we...
So that was really answering a question. So how can we protect our farms from the impact of floods? So it's creating this buffering system. What is the actual effect of microbes and worms in the flooded water when we're in the floods?
What is the effect of...
The effect on the
flooding,
microbes.
of flooding on the microbes, right?
Yeah.
Okay, well obviously the microbes, to live like any living thing, they need substrate, food, they need basically, obviously genetics, that they're there, but they also need a conducive environment. And critical for these microbes is they need enough oxygen to grow. Not 21% as we do up here, but they need, oxygen partial pressures of about 10% plus. And once you waterlog a soil, when this is all underwater, then obviously there isn't enough oxygen. And so then the microbes and the worms and everything living in that soil would progressively die. So, flooding a soil will then kill those microbes and turn it into anaerobic conditions. Other anaerobic microbes will take over, producing methane and other things, but they're not the conditions you need that are conducive for growth. There's a bit of redemption that basically, obviously these microbes are pretty tough, they're adapted to conditions. So no, they can survive for 10 days of flooding, and basically live physiologically and survive. And so as we saw in the hydrograph, if basically, there we go, further. Okay, if there's enough basically conditions restore themselves, then the organisms can survive, right? So they can survive, inundation, but as long as the water goes into the soil, oxygen can come back again. So yes, they can be flooded for 5-10 days and survive, but if they're flooded for a long, long time, then the whole soil becomes anoxic, and then structurally it collapses because those microbes that created the system and sustained it are gone.
I have actually seen soil pits, Walter, where the waterlogging and then the worms are below where it's waterlogged. So they can actually move around in the soil if they've got that capacity.
Yeah, the worms definitely can move in that soil, but they'll be sort of upstairs feeding on organic matter and stuff like that, and then moving back into the moist environment. So they move in the profile, but if it's constant, you'll see that after a big flooding rain event, all the worms have come up onto the pavements, onto the footpath. The birds are having a feast because basically it's just too wet down under, so they've got to come up for oxygen and of course become vulnerable to eat. So as a rule, yes, anaerobic flooded conditions are adverse to these microbes, but there is this natural tolerance, and where we have the sponge and this longevity of growing, there's enough buffering and there's enough periods for those organisms to keep surviving and keep functioning.
So it's really building that buffer before the flood comes.
Precisely, yeah. And that's a very important point, that this buffer has to be there effectively before the flood. You know, when the flood comes, you can't just immediately say, hang on, I need a sponge, right?
Yeah. I'll keep going. I'm often asked this one, while my crop or pasture is flooded, is there benefit to applying a biostimulant by an aerial application, or should we wait until the water resides? I think we nearly just answered that.
Yeah, well, we in a sense answered that, didn't we? Because, again, we made the point here. Look, this is what's driving it. If these things are flooded, they've got no oxygen, yeah, you can pour biostimulant on, but you can't switch them on because oxygen is a limiting factor. Okay, so biostimulant won't help. But if there is some oxygen there, because you have got some sponge, and you do want to increase the activity, then it is possible to stimulate them, but not if it's totally flooded, right? This is really, yes, if there's a soil that's partially wet, I need to increase the fungal or microbial activity, then it's possible to stimulate them, yes.
Yeah, but that long-term flood, you would wait until that resides.
Yeah.
Will a flood decrease the carbon levels that I have built, or that buffer and air that I have built?
Okay, it's an interesting thing. This is what will the flood do to the carbon, the bed springs, the organic matter we've created. Well, obviously, if there's no oxygen in the soil because it's flooded, then yes, there won't be oxygen because it's oxygenation that could break down these carbon bonds, through turning carbon into CO2. So that process is slowed down, right? And so a peat soil which is constantly flooded builds very high carbon because it has got very low oxygen and therefore limited oxidation. So basically it'll slow down carbon breakdown, but if it kills all the organisms, then it has a negative effect because you're not putting any more carbon there. And also you're creating anaerobic conditions so that a lot of the carbon, rather than going off into CO2, can be now through anaerobic organisms be turned into methane. You see, so it's 6 of one, half of a dozen the others. Yes, some of the processes are slowed, but if you go too hard, then it turns into other toxic processes, methane and anaerobic microorganisms, which are not conducive to plant growth.
Will the flood decrease the quality of the organic matter in the soil?
Okay, well, same sort of story. I mean, here's the quantity of organic matter. Will the flood decrease the quality? Yes, it will. And again, it's the same balance. How much degradation, oxidation are we getting? Are we getting more of that methane, the anaerobic methane producing the much lower quality? And vice versa, I mean, same thing with the organisms, yes, they're switching more to anaerobic organisms. Can the carbon building, organic organism, the aerobic organisms survive? So yes, the qualitative differences apply and have effect.
So there still is hope if you've built a good buffering system and you're in a long-term flood. That carbon will stay there.
Oh, yes.
It's just that it will slowly be used up.
Okay, if you've already got, as you saw in the hydrograph, as you basically are building, like a infiltration in-soil reservoir, you've got basically growing conditions coming back again after 5 days, then you're building carbon in a very positive way, and carbon will stay. It's only when you basically have flood events, it's anaerobic, and of course you've got this issue of erosion here, haven't you? Because basically, if you've got a very high flood peak, all your topsoil is eroded anyway, so you've lost all your organic matter. So that's a very important thing. We must remember that, like Australia or most of the agricultural world, we're actually farming subsoils. We're no longer farming the original organic surface soils because they were all lost in previous massive flood events.
I imagine having that ground cover would help with the erosion in the flood.
Oh yeah, and this is important again, longevity of green. It's basically, again, having the sponge, having the in-soil reservoirs, having the longevity of green, that protects that whole situation enormously. And it's also this speed of regrowth. Gabe Brown, he's in the central US, but one of the very leading innovative regenerative farmers, and he had basically a major 8-inch rainfall event in his area, and his neighbour's land was completely inundated, waterlogged, and because of winter it was there for 9 months and so really sodden and completely dead effectively. But Gabe basically, because he had that sort of sponge, the in-soil reservoirs, he was able to keep things growing. So sure, things slowed down for a week or so, but then he got back to growth and actually was benefiting from all that water.
We've certainly had feedback from farmers that have been building this soil sponge for some time, and in flooded crops they're actually able to harvest them where before they weren't able to because they hadn't built that.
This is another thing, obviously, when we have listed all this, but just the lodgement, the crops lodge, like fall over, stems become weak, they fall over, they can't be harvested. So under healthy soil conditions, the crops are much, much more resilient, have higher turgor pressure, they're much stronger stems, right? So that basically these stems are stronger and they won't fall over, and basically you are still able to harvest. I can wipe this out, but I may shouldn't do this, should I? Yeah. I don't know.
So practically, I think if we think about fallow in crops, it would be in a flooded situation much more beneficial to have something green growing there. How can we do that?
All the time. I mean, the sustainability, the longevity is critically important to have. Soils covered with green growth because it protects it from erosion, wind, desiccation, but also it sort of basically allows it to regrow again opportunistically as soon as conditions apply. And the perenniality of this becomes very important because rather than having like an annual crop and then we've got to re-sow it, no, you've got basically a perennial system there that can respond. And the longevity of growth dividend is enormous. Yeah.
Leads into our next question. What are some of the key things we can do to increase carbon levels?
Okay, so like increasing carbon level, so that's another bigger story. We've talked about that previously in other webinars, and we won't go into all great detail here because it's a whole story by itself. But it's really a very simple thing of A, B, C, and the whole capacity to grow carbon in soil really depends on these three factors and us managing them. And the first, of course, is agriculture, and that's simply growing plants. It's simply basically taking CO2 plus water, sunlight through plants, and making sugars, C6H12O6, plus, of course, oxygen as a waste product, 6 oxygens. Okay, and that's photosynthesis, and that's really green growth on this planet, universal. And so we're excellent at agriculture, maximising the growth of plants, and quite frankly, we need to keep on doing that because we've got to feed 10 billion people, we've got to re-green the planet. So excellent A is so critically important, right? But then the next thing is not just how much green growth we can grow, but what matters then is what happens to every gram of green growth that we do grow. Critically important, you see? And there's only two things that can happen to every gram of biomass that's ever been produced. It can either burn or oxidize back to CO2. Okay, so there's CO2 was captured by the plant, it can simply burn and oxidize back to CO2. Or conversely, it can turn into stable soil carbon. Okay, and the simple thing is this is a burning function, and obviously, yeah, it's burn. You can burn it, we can clear it, we can put fire to it, burn it, but a whole lot of current practices that we're doing, whether it's clearing, over-fertilizing, cultivating, biocides, bare fallowing. So a lot of our agricultural practices are very oxidative. Okay, and they are basically turning 100 to 130% of A into B, into CO2, right? I mean, it's not just turning most of the plant growth we're growing, but also a lot of the heritage carbon, so it's often 130%. So our management practices, industrial agriculture now, is really, as we say, over-fertilizing, biocides, clearing, fallowing, cultivating, really driving this CO2. And of course, that's what we see in our CO2 climate story, a symptom of oxidation of our land system. And in a sense, that's a dilemma that we're in. We've basically maximized agriculture, but to maximize it, we've taken all these inputs, and of course, that's now trying to increase it, but with that, we're destroying the whole planet and the soils. And nature didn't do that. Nature sort of said, no, if I can grow plants A, I want to limit B, and I want to maximize carbon, soil carbon fixation. Okay? Yes, soil carbon. Okay, so that's what nature is trying to do. And of course, nature does that, again, as we saw, through microbes, right? Particularly fungi. And these fungi are the critical things that are important, okay? Critically important in turning organic matter, dead plant material, into humates, and also root exudates from these plant growth into another compound we call glomalin. These are glues that sort of bind soils, make the soil sponge. And this is really, yes, soil organic matter, right? Soil, stable soil carbon. And so really it's a balance of B and C. And we control that in our land management. How much we've got this oxidative, high expensive inputs, or how much we actually have fostering the fungi that are turning these things. And again, this is where biostimulants come in, because it's the biostimulants that of course are driving the fungal activity. We've got a very great advantage, because if we have this as a plant, okay, and here's roots, then quite frankly, a plant already naturally, we just see it above the ground, and that's where we sort of focus, but this might only be 30% to 40% of the plant's growth. But 70% of the plant is actually already, or the sugars from the plant is producing, A, is already being invested down under in roots and root exudates. And so by having the 70% down under and having active healthy fungi because of biostimulants, we can actually build soil carbon at a pretty prodigious rate. There's a little bit of space here, and so we want to basically not leave it. Nature doesn't have spaces, so we've got to have another thing called D, and we call these dividends. And this is really powerful because she's very clever, because by simply increasing soil carbon, every gram of carbon she puts into the soil, she gets 8 to 20 grams of soil water retention. Okay, and we saw that previously in our graph, in our little diagram, that water holding storage capacity. So really every gram of carbon, we think we increase the water retention capacity of that soil. Every gram of carbon we can put into that soil massively increases the biofertility, the availability of nutrients in that soil. Every gram of carbon we put in that soil increases the rootability of soil, the capacity of roots to proliferate to depth. So instead of growing in 10 centimeters of soil, we grow roots in a meter of soil. So we've got 10 times the volume of soil resource. And so these dividends are really critical, because it's those dividends that is how nature drove productivity in agriculture. Okay, by having all these positive feedback dividends, in terms of water holding capacity, biofertility, roots, resilience. We're in a nature-drove agriculture. The other point about the dividends is critically important, because if we have this driving agriculture, we don't need this mechanism. We can actually negate most of these oxidative practices. So yeah, for farmers to grow soil carbon, it's a simple matter of maximising what you do well, growing plants, but switching your whole management so you minimise B and you maximise this fungal activity through biostimulants. And innovative farmers are doing that, 10 tonnes of carbon per hectare per annum, but not all farmers have to be there straight away. Every gram of carbon you're putting extra into your soil is benefiting through all these dividends, right? So don't beat yourself up that somebody else is doing more than you. Different soils have different rates, but certainly our innovative farmers all over the world are doing 10 tonnes carbon per hectare per annum plus, but the real issue, they're getting these dividends from that, not just the carbon credits.
This graph, Walter, really challenges the view, and it's not my view, that growing big biomass from fertiliser increases my organic matter more, so therefore increases my carbon, but we seem to be missing a quadrant in that view of C.
Okay, this is important to sort of basically highlight. Yes, I mean, agriculture is selling you more on. I guess you can increase more yields by putting more costly inputs on, right? But of course that is oxidating, the soil, degrading, mining your soil, destroying. But that is also totally killing the microbial activity down under. You're sterilising that soil effectively. Okay, so you're in a lose-lose game, because you're into more on, but it's costing you much more money. You're destroying your soil capital. You're destroying the processes that naturally give you these dividends. So it's lose, 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 big time. But of course it's profit for the people who are selling the more on fertilisers.
Interesting. The next question is, how can over-application of fertilisers reduce our soil sponge?
Well, yeah, okay, and it says it, doesn't it? Because basically over-application is reducing the sponge, because it's turning that sponge into CO2 in our climate crisis. Obviously we're compacting, concreting our catchments, therefore we have the floods, the hydrograph, but it's also killing the whole microbial life of the soil, and in that destroying its water holding capacity, biofertility, its rootability, its resilience, its buffering cactus. We're back to desert.
Again, you have covered this, but it's good to just see it as a question. If the soil becomes anaerobic, does it then potentially emit methane gas?
Yes, I mean not always, depending on, we've got the methanotrophs, the organisms that cause it, but yet they'll be there. And so generally speaking, as a soil becomes anaerobic, then instead of carbon oxidizing to CO2, that carbon will oxidize instead to CH4, and of course give off a methane gas. And basically the organisms, the anaerobic conditions, are then destroying or inhibiting that in a big way. The difference is things like tundras, peat soils, where basically there's so little oxygen, there's so little nitrogen that they're just literally just layering down carbon, organic matter. They're just really flooding organic matter, because the oxidation process is so low, the nitrogen process is so low that even the methanotrophs are having a trouble.
Leaching aside, does excessive moisture affect the availability of any soil minerals?
Excessive soil moisture affect the availability of soil minerals. Yeah, obviously, as I said, leaching, you can lose those soil things. Okay, let's go back to the first one. keep going. Keep going. I'm not. The whiteboards are good, but I. Yeah. Okay. So here we are. Basically, again, the solubilization of minerals. This is primary petagenesis. So as we said before, you need the right conditions of genetics in the organisms, the substrate, basically, like yes, I've got sugars in there from roots and stuff, and I've got the right environmental conditions, right? And that then allows solubilization of nutrients and the building of the sponge. Now, the question was, if I have basically flooded soils, do I stop that solubilization availability? And the answer is yes, you would, because you are actually knocking out basically the activity of these organisms. And these organisms, 80% of the fertility of soils isn't the quantity of nutrients, it's how much those nutrients are made available through the activity of the microbes. It's a fixation, solubilization, access, uptake, cycling of nutrients in a soil that govern 80% of its biofertility. If you knock out those microbes, you're actually losing all those fertility functions. And you're leaching nutrients in the flooded water. So yes, it can be detrimental.
So the solubilization can be, but if we're holding our carbon and our carbon is holding our nutrients, they should still be there potentially after the flood.
No. This is actually, we should draw another graph then, should we? Oops. I don't know if this is wasting time, but there's another thing we haven't talked about. It's coming into the whole nutritional dividends. Right. There's another whole sort of, there we are. There's another whole part of the system we haven't talked about. So we've got organic matter, and they're really complex, long polymerized chain of carbon molecules. And this organic matter has got extremely high levels of negative charges on it, right? Compared to sand or clay, it's very, very high, and we don't have to go into the numbers. And these negative charges, of course, are very, very important because they're the things that absorb then cations, whether it's calcium or zinc or magnesium or selenium or all the trace elements. And so this is your cation exchange capacity of your soil. And it very much depends on the organic matter content, right? And so anything that degrades organic matter will actually compromise that cation exchange capacity, the capacity of that soil to hold and make available essential plant nutrients. So now the question, you read it again?
So the question was, does excessive moisture affect the availability of soil minerals? So you have agreed that it affects the availability because the microbes aren't making them available.
Yeah.
My next question was, does it stay there for when the microbes return after the flood?
So basically these, depending how long this organic matter is saturated, certainly the charges still apply, but if this organic matter is now being broken down and turned into methane, then the answer is you're losing that. So it's a question again, where we had the hygrograph. If you've got a short period of flooding, it can retain. If you have a long period of flooding, you're losing organic matter, then you're progressively losing cation exchange capacity and nutrient availability. But again, each site and soil, there's a balance of processes, and you'd have to, the numbers applying to it would depend on that soil.
Sure. Apart from very rough paddocks, what is the effect on the soil of extensive pugging by livestock due to the wet?
Okay, well look, obviously if you've got wet soil and it hasn't got a good root mat and cover crop on it, and they're really very important in protecting that soil and taking the pressure from the animals above. But if you break through that and then you're compacting that soil, then effectively you're going back to square one, rock, because now you've got this compacted mineral matrix, back to bulk densities of 3 or 2.5, 3, and basically no oxygen, no rootability, etc. And when it dries, it's like concrete, and so you basically, with pugging, with animals in the wet, you've destroyed that soil, taken it back to rock effectively. So you've got to start again. The bottom line is you try to avoid that again by a continual longevity of green growth, green cover, good deep perennial root mat that can take the weight of the animals, but also of course not overgrazing. Like this is where grazing pressure is important. Yeah.
What soil recovery time or the time frame can we expect?
Right, okay, so good question. Many answers to this. Obviously it depends how badly the soil is being degraded, right? There's a valid point, if just left to itself, it takes thousands of years for some soils to recover, right? It just incrementally. But on the other hand, innovative regenerative agriculture all over the planet is able to rebuild healthy soils, healthy soil structures through the ABC process we talked about, and amazingly rapidly, 3 to 10 years, we can actually take a degraded soil. Classic is our colleagues in the Netherlands. They take toxic saline sludge from the bottom of the Rhine River, all the garbage from Switzerland and Germany, and basically within 10 years, through this accelerated ABCD process, turn it into very rich polder soils with 10% organic matter. So yes, we can grow these soils, we can do this. Again, these are extreme cases, but most farmers in using ABC can progressively move it, and within 3 years they're normally seeing positive benefits from the dividends that they're creating. They're not finished, you're never finished. Even if you've got a soil at a plateau level, 8% carbon, there's always a paddock next door or somewhere else that you can regenerate.
Compaction issues from the wet. Should we be physically aerating our soils?
Okay, this is physically aerating your soils. Well, obviously, when it's wet and you're coming on with heavy equipment, you've got to ask yourself, is the actual equipment, the weight of the equipment compacting the soil even more? And mostly it is. If I then rip up that soil mechanically and there's no sponge, no bed springs to hold the particles together, they'll just simply collapse back to a sponge. So you waste a lot of fuel, you do a lot of compaction, but for very, very little effect. And so this mechanical cultivation, you've got to say no. But the best thing is what lots of the innovative farmers are doing. They say, look, we can just sow those lands with cover crops, deep-rooted, multi-species cover crops, root system, jackhammer plants that open up, put roots down to depth. And if you have a multi-species cover crop, often wheat species, they can effectively help aerate and restructure those soils through their roots and root exudates and the ABC process fairly rapidly.
And they won't collapse again.
And they won't collapse again, and it's a fraction of the cost, 1% of the cost of being on there with equipment.
Yeah. What happens to the fungi and bacteria in the root zone? This is a specific rice question. When rice goes to permanent flood, I guess it's any
Okay. Okay. So basically, yes, when rice is permanently flooded, then yes, the fungi and the bacteria in the root zone switch to those anaerobic organisms, and the aerobic organisms effectively die out. There are some beneficial aerobic, for example, blue-green algae will grow under those conditions, produce prodigious quantities of nitrogen, which of course the rice crop then uses for its growth. But yes, certainly when you have a rice crop continually flooded, then basically you move it to an anaerobic microbial ecology and you kill all that aerobic microbial ecology.
Another specific one to rice is applying NutriSoil to seed and the foliage of rice before the permanent water a waste of time?
Yeah, okay, well, this is again specific and you'd have to look at a particular situation, but as we say, when we've talked about biostimulants, they're actually stimulating the activity of these organisms, these fungi in the soil. And so you've got to ask yourself first the question, are the fungi able to be active? Are they, are they there? One, are they there? Are they environmental conditions conducive to them being active? And are there some benefits from stimulating their activity? Often that is the case. Often in Australia's soils, activities are perhaps 1% of what it is optimally. And so, yes, biostimulants can be very beneficial. But you've really got to look at the particular situation. Then the question is whether it's a seed dressing or a foliar. And yeah, a seed dressing obviously comes at sowing. A foliar, it gives you some leverage of putting biostimulant on during the growth of the crop, but then you've got to look at, okay, how effective is the foliar? Because if the fungi in the soil, how do we, how much of that foliar spray can leach and stimulate down under?
So it's really probably going back to the preparation 3 years before of that soil,
yes.
before that last crop.
Yes, if we can, yes, and the whole point of biostimulation is if we can build that healthy system beforehand, and we've got that resilient, buffered, perennial longevity of green, then we don't even have the problem.
What happens to the soil biota during drought?
Well, much the same thing, but we saw, again, from our longevity of green growth, we may not have to go back to it, but the fact is, you see, do we want a drought? Do we have a drought? Can we actually... There we are. See, if we've got this longevity of green growth, even if we hadn't a rainfall event, if we've got 100 days of in-soil reservoir water storage, do we have a drought? The organisms obviously adapted to dry conditions very, very well. The fungi, bacteria survive much, much better than plants under dry conditions, so they're not going to go out. Their activity might drop a bit, but the bottom line again, if we have longevity of green because we've got these in-soil reservoirs, we've in a sense drought-proofed, we've buffered this drought effect. Okay, because we've actually removed that because we've got the in-soil reservoir storage. It's quite interesting, back in 10 years ago we were talking about Northern Australia and drought-proofing Northern Australia. And we did all the analysis. If we can build soil carbon across our rangelands in Northern Australia, which we can, we've demonstrated that, and if we can keep an extra 300 millimetres of water infiltrated into those soils from the summer monsoons, then over 300 million hectares of Northern Australia we can put 1 billion litres of water to recharge our in-soil reservoirs. That's equivalent to 200 Lake Humes, water that's available when and where you need it across the landscape, protected from evaporation effectively at no cost to the taxpayer. Okay, so the magnitude of this drought-proofing potential of longevity of green, of rebuilding the sponge, rebuilding the in-soil reservoirs is just colossal. And now it's actually critically important because with climate change, as things go drier, as climate extremes, this buffering that we talked about, forget the graph, that buffering capacity is so critical. So that buffering not just for floods, but the buffering for droughts and that drought proofing through the sponge in soil reservoirs is the only thing that can save us.
We've come up to our last question.
Please, yeah.
So with soils so waterlogged and in an anaerobic condition, how can soil temperature increase?
Okay, well, the answer is very difficult because basically when you have all that water in a soil, bring that temperature of that soil up takes a lot of heat because obviously water can store so much heat per unit volume, right? So that wet soil will stay colder for much, much longer. Now that'll restrict root growth, that'll restrict microbial growth, and so I think the waterlogged soil will be much reduced temperature and reduced microbial activity, partly because of the temperature. Now obviously in tropical areas, it's not going to, it'll still be warm enough, but see mostly microbes and roots only become active once it gets over 8-10 degrees centigrade. And obviously if you've got waterlogged, wet, cold, boggy conditions, it's more or less switched off plant growth.
Again, it comes back to that buffering beforehand, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Is there any other questions from live stream that I need to address, guys? Yep.
There is one.
There's
Will
one.
I just read it out?
Yeah, that would be great.
Please,
Thanks,
yeah,
Shelley.
yeah.
Okay, so question is, with these techniques, is it truly possible to turn back our soil to a resilient carbon and nitrogen available soil ecosystem?
Yes, no, totally, and of course it's very clear that yes, we can, and more than hypothetically or academically, our innovative leading farmers are doing that. If you take, for example, our colleagues, the Haggertys in Western Australia, 8-inch rainfall environment, very, very old bleached mongrel sands, bastard sands they call them, and yeah, they're growing reliably, 2-3 tons of wheat per hectare, because they've built the soil organic matter, they've built their sponge, they've built their microbial ecology, they've built their resilience, they've built their buffering, and even in that extreme environment they're able to do that. So yes, we can, but the issue is these are the innovators, these are the 2%, 1% that are really leading, and the real issue, the challenge for Australian agriculture is when will we wake up and realise that moron isn't going to get us there, that we've got to really regenerate these natural processes, because only they will give us the future we need.
Walter, have you visited the Soil Museum in the Netherlands, and are there any plans in Australia for an education?
Yeah, no, look, I haven't visited the Soil Museum, but I'm aware of that education facility. We certainly have done a lot about soil education as part of the thing, especially for young people, but also especially with urban agriculture, because 70% of us will be actually living in urban concentrations, and really it's how do we regenerate soils and food production in those urban agricultural situations. But certainly that education, the empowerment of youth, and really giving youth what we call sovereign soil, the capacity to regenerate your own soil, to actually take charge, to be empowered to take this forward, not just be dependent on farmers alone or the industrial agricultural system for the future, because that's not going to get us there.
I've got another one. What's your view on using Johnson-Su bioreactor, fish and seaweed and other biofertiliser products?
Okay, well look, that's getting into specifics. Now obviously we have organic matter, and ABCD discussion, we have organic matter. Now the question is, how does that best convert into stable soil carbon, through what microbial processes? And some of the composting processes of course do that very well. And yeah, Johnson-Su basically composting system has tried to perfect that, but again it's specific for what that location, or not location, but that system, that situation, and it's one of the tools in the toolbox. But I don't think we're really picking winners here. We're saying whatever's working in each application, and as much as possible going back to the natural processes, because nature's been at this game 420 million years and she's way ahead of us in terms of smarts and skills.
I don't know if you can answer this one succinctly,
Please.
quickly, Walter, but I'll give you the chance. And we've briefly touched on it. Can we install the soil sponge into the built environment?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. No, look, and this is the power. Okay, absolutely. This is the power of it. Every square metre of soil, you're standing on the solution. You're empowered. Yes, we can bring that square metre of soil back into health, back into the sponge, and 10 square metres of that soil can feed your green food requirements. So the empowerment of people to take that initiative, sovereign soil, and regenerating that soil through these natural processes, using biostimulants to make it happen, extremely important.
And I think we've got one here. What can we do to help rebuild the microbiology after the soil has been underwater for so many weeks?
Okay, once we've put the soil effectively flooded, etc., then we have to start from square one, and how do we accelerate, and we put plants there, and then we have an accelerated succession of organisms, and yes, we can stimulate that succession of organisms and plants, as we said in the Netherlands, and so within 10 years, take toxic saline slime, anaerobic slime into healthy, productive polder soils.
Awesome.
Growing tulips for your kitchen table.
Walter, thank you. It has been so wonderful.
No, thank you very much.
Today
And I hope that it sort of answered the questions, but it's that saying, look, these natural processes, you can't escape them. They're the building blocks for the ecosystems we evolved in, we depend on, and it's really just how quickly can we get back to saying, look, we need to regenerate these, that buffering, that resilience, because that's critically for our future.
Absolutely. So it's really working before the floods and after the floods on building this buffering. I think people always want to know more. So where can people find out more? I think they can call us at NutriSoil.
Yes,
we have some people that we work alongside. RCS Consulting Services are really good for grazing management, helping with grazing. Soil Land Food with David Hardwick, more extension on soil health. Regen Farming, Luke Harrington helps people with transitioning, as does Robin Tate in Tasmania. And there's a number of other people, so we can connect you if you give us a call to where your specific area might be needed.
Certainly. And just to reinforce the whole point of the talk, the floods and droughts, they are symptoms of our land degradation. And by basically regenerating that sponge, regenerating that soil, we can eliminate the risk of these symptoms significantly. So it's not a matter we're battling floods and droughts, it's a matter we don't need to have them, we can have longevity of green growth instead, simply by building the sponge.
Another thing, we talked about NutriSoil being really concerned about how farmers are dealing with the floods at the moment, and that's why we indeed got you here to help with those types of challenging situations and questions, Walter. But NutriSoil is actually having a free freight flood appeal. I don't know if we call it appeal, but from today, there's a promotion. From today, we are offering free freight for anyone who would like to get NutriSoil. There is a code you use with the online system, and the code is FLOODS2022. That code will come out tomorrow to other people, but you can actually use that code now. So it's FLOODS2022, and that goes for a 2-week period. So wonderful. Thank you everyone for being on live stream today, and you can watch this afterwards and also send it on to people that you think would benefit from today. So thank you again, Walter.
Thank you very much.